Hi, everybody. My name is Toni Marcolini. Welcome to the podcast. It may interest you to know. Uh, Today, we're going to take a little trip back in time. I have two fabulous guests with me, both retired members of the bench. So let me start by welcoming a common co-host for me, Bradley Ferencz.
Nice to be here.
Welcome, Judge. And also a brand new guest I'm having today, retired Honorable John Jorgensen. So welcome, Judge number two.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So today we're going to go back in time to what is an old mystery. I say mystery, everyone has their theory that makes it, that sort of makes up their own mind as to what happened. But here in New Jersey, we have this unsolved double homicide case pending from the 1920s. There was a trial, they call trial of the century, that happened here, where the suspects, I'll call them, were acquitted. It brings the most fame, I think, to New Jersey for being the first of its kind, the first sensationalized tabloid
Tabloids.
reading, yeah, news of its kind, where you had the New York Times coming in and following along, and as well as what was the evolution of tabloid journalism today, where not so reputable papers were covering it in that sense of let's just sell a lot of papers. And this was the first time it had happened in this country. So Judge Jorgensen, you're a historian, if you will, in this area. You've done an enormous amount of research. Well, I always remember you being interested in history. Let me start by saying that. I can remember walking the halls to your chambers when we were going in for a conference, and it was covered in like the pictures of the presidents.
Yes.
Uh, right. So you were always a big history buff. I'll ask you that first. I mean, were you interested in history as a kid? Did it come later in life?
Well, growing up in New Jersey, I mean, the Revolutionary War was essentially fought here in New Jersey. And so, I always had great teachers that had an interest in history that kind of relayed that information to me. So I was always interested in history. I majored in history in college. But the funny thing is, I was very interested in American Revolution. One thing that I was not interested in at all was the Civil War. And when I got out of law school, I started reading something about the Civil War. And my mom told me, your great grandfather fought for the Fifth Ohio Cavalry with General Sherman going across the Georgia. And so I got very interested in the Civil War, and I ended up writing actually five books on the Battle of Gettysburg. So that's been my sort of my claim to fame, so to speak, as a published historian. So.
And then there comes a point in time, I guess, when you heard about this particular mystery, right? I mean, I think most of us who practice law in New Jersey sort of have an interest in it, right? Because it's
Sure.
it's unsolved. Maybe you can just give a capsulized summary of what actually happened.
Sure. Uh, the double murders occurred on the evening of September 14th of 1922. The two people that were murdered, one was Reverend Edward Hall. He was the pastor of St. John Episcopal Church on George Street in New Brunswick. And he had been having an affair for about 4 years with one of the choir singers, Eleanor Mills. Eleanor was married and she had two teenage sons. And the Reverend was also married. He was married to a woman, Frances Stevens. Frances Stevens was part of the Stevens family, which had ties to the Johnson and Johnson people. So she came from money. She was about 7 or 8 years older than he was, and he was about 8 years older than his mistress. Well, they apparently had a tryst, so to speak, on Lovers Lane and Franklin Township, just over the border of Middlesex County into Somerset County. And apparently, late around 10 o'clock on the evening of September 14th of 1922, they were both murdered. The bodies were found Saturday morning, September 16th of 1922, and the Reverend Hall, they were found lying almost as if they were just sleeping next to each other in this lovers' lane next to what they refer to as a crabapple tree. And their arms were entwined with each other, and there were some ripped up love letters between the two of them. And the Reverend Hall had been killed with one gunshot to the head. Eleanor Mills had 3 gunshots to the right side of her head, and apparently they had cut her throat from ear to ear and took out her tongue and her larynx. So somebody had it in, obviously, for Eleanor Mills, and so that's the double murders when it occurred and when they first found out about it.
You know, before you continue, Toni Ann, you used the word unsolved.
Which
And
I use lightly, but yes.
I think I have to take a half a step back. There was a trial that I'm sure John will get into shortly, and there was an adjudication of not guilty, but let us not forget that in order for it to be guilty, it must be guilt proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I think as we sit here and we learn the history of the actual trial itself, the 90 front page articles that the New York Times ran during the course of the trial, you know, and the other tabloids, the Hearst publications, which really, and I think your analysis is correct, it was beginning of the tabloid era. I think that we have to acknowledge to some extent that there's a significant degree of certainty, although people have argued over who at least participated in the homicide. How exactly it occurred, we can argue about. Whether or not specific people might have been there other than the jilted wife, I don't know. But the fact that it is there's no adjudication of guilt, you know, it's kind of like the O.J. Simpson trial. There was a not guilty verdict, but when it came to the civil matter where there was a large verdict for the plaintiff, I think if you looked at the standard of proof, one being beyond a reasonable doubt for the criminal trial, and one being by a fair preponderance of the credible evidence, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, I think we're pretty certain who was involved in the homicide. So,
Oh, I mean, and I agree. I mean, it seemed to me like if you were investigating this at the time, I mean, their love letters are torn up and left around them. Right? This is not a huge pool of candidates. I mean, who has access? It's obviously somebody who lives with one or the other. I mean, you're talking about truly a limited pool of people. And as Judge Jorgensen, as you said, the person who killed her was a lot angrier with her.
Oh, yes.
Right, than the person who killed him, which to me, you know,
you say what might we infer from that?
yeah.
What might we reasonably infer from the kicking out of her tongue and larynx, given the fact that she was a soprano in the church choir that was run by the Episcopalian husband of the widow?
Yes.
You know, what it says to me anyway, is that a lot of people say, oh, like maybe it was her husband then who had enough hate for her. And I say, no, the opposite. That's somebody who was jealous of the effect her singing maybe had on the men who watched her, or their husband, right? Who they say she was somewhat uh transfixed. I mean, you couldn't help but being sucked into that energy, almost a sexual energy, even when she sang. There was just, I guess, there's something beautiful about her voice, and I guess that was visible. And it always looked to me that somebody who was jealous would have done that or caused that maybe to be done.
Yeah, I read as I was looking at the newspapers published during the time that the most affectionate thing that was written about the widow was that you couldn't call her totally unattractive. Apparently, she's not the most attractive person, and an act of kind was to call her not totally unattractive. Whereas the decedent, the young lady with whom the affair was allegedly happening, you've seen pictures of her, and they've been published, and she was a very attractive woman, 34 years old, 14 years younger than the wife.
Yeah, all the pictures that I've seen of the wife, that's a pretty good accurate assessment. you couldn't call her unattractive, but
Totally, I think the word is totally unattractive.
totally unattractive. Yes, yeah. But and she was referred to by the press during the trial as the Iron Widow. She was very staid, just stayed right on task. Interesting enough that we've talked about the possible people that did it. William Kunstler, the famed criminal defense attorney, back in 1964, wrote a book about the Hall Mills murder trial, and it was his conclusion was that the Ku Klux Klan was responsible for killing the two people. The Klan was pretty active in New Jersey back in the 1920s, but I'm pretty confident it was not them. It was they had the right people. They just didn't find them enough evidence to find them guilty.
I think that the reality is that the conspiracy theories that Kunstler believed in at times were consistent with his conspiracy theory as to who committed the murder.
Yes.
I don't think the Ku Klux Klan had a problem with Episcopal ministers, as I recall, both of whom were Caucasian. So
Yeah.
I don't think they were targeted.
And wouldn't have had access to, I'd argue again, to the love letters. I mean, you truly do need somebody. They're torn up older love letters, right? I mean, it's not like, oh, they just were exchanging one letter at the scene.
Yeah.
There's a stack of love letters, which it would indicate somebody found them or brought them there to accuse, right?
Yeah.
To have proof. And
Interestingly, the day before the murders, the Reverend had did an annual trip to Lake Hopatcong,
Yeah.
and he took with him
I
his
think the
mother,
wife, right, and the lover.
his mother, the wife, the lover, and another person that helped out at the church, and they had a wonderful day. And when they came back, James Mills, the husband of the choir singer, had found it stuffed in a kind of like a bag that was hanging on the back of a door, a number of those undated and unsigned letters. So he had them the day before the murders occurred. So you're right. Somebody has letters, and somebody perhaps brought the letters to the scene and ripped them up there.
One of the things, I'm sorry, that Jay, you pointed out is that the wife in the case came from considerable, I'll call it wealth. She was related, as I understand it, to the Johnson & Johnson heirs, and were somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.7 to $2 million.
She was worth a lot, and you're right. She was. They had ties with Johnson & Johnson heirs, so she was the wealthy widow, so to speak. And she and her husband lived in the Stevens mansion on 23 Nickel Street in New Brunswick. Beautiful. In fact, the president of Douglas College lives there now. That's her residence.
Sure, it kind of became part of Rutgers University.
Yep.
So, Judge, I mean, there comes a point in time where they start investigating, right? Arguably, in today's day and age, I mean, I hate to say it's a slam dunk, but in today's day and age, the forensic evidence that would have been gathered, at the scene would have been damning.
Well, that's part of the problem. The crime scene was overrun by people that were just coming out, looking at things.
Spectators.
Yeah, the Somerset County prosecutor's office took a little while to get there. There was a photographer from one of the newspapers who was handling some of the evidence. And you're right. Today with DNA and blood samples, it would be pretty easily, I think, to get a conviction. But it really became a circus out there, and for several days and a couple of weeks after the murders, people were going out there, lining up to see it, and people were selling popcorn, and it was a circus atmosphere.
And they arrest somebody different first, right? They arrested the teenagers who found the bodies, or the male teenager who found the body.
Yeah, the people that found the body was a 22-year-old man who was married, and a 15-year-old girl who was not married.
Not married.
They were supposedly out there. They were looking for mushrooms.
Indeed.
By the way, as you say, they're looking for mushrooms, Jay. Wasn't that area designated as a lover's lane
Yes, it was,
as
and
opposed to a forestry center for wild mushrooms?
yes, and I had the opportunity to read some of the transcripts of the first grand jury, which was um, gave testimony in November of 1922, and the girl's testimony clearly indicated that they weren't looking for mushrooms. She was doing something else. But anyhow, they were the ones who found the bodies. They actually thought that the two people were just sleeping. And when they found out that they were dead, they reached out. The New Brunswick police came, and initially in the first couple of days, the kid, the Raymond Schneider, was the 22-year-old. He pointed the finger to a friend of his, and he said that the friend of his was dating the 15-year-old girl. The 15-year-old girl, her father was had a pool hall in New Brunswick and was having an incestuous relationship with his daughter. The girl unfortunately ended up in a home for incorrigibles. She's certainly had some problems. So, but Ray Schneider said, "Hey, no, it was her boyfriend that was the one that pulled the trigger," and they arrested the kid. And shortly thereafter, the citizens of New Brunswick were actually taking up collecting money for his defense fund, because they were shocked that he was being fingered as the killer of the pastor and the choir singer. But he spent a couple of days in jail, and then they finally released him. They had absolutely no evidence whatsoever to be able to pin it on him. And Ray Schneider came under considerable grief as a result of that.
He withdrew the allegation, as I recall, too. At some point, said there was no confession to him. He had made it up.
Correct. Yes, he did. Yeah.
Probably, I would think as a, as a way of getting a potential competitor for the girl out of the way. I don't know.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, I
one of
guess
the
by
things,
also saying that he was her boyfriend. I'm sure that Ray Schneider's wife didn't take all that kindly that they were out there looking for mushrooms, so you can pass it along that way as well. Sure, you're right, Dawn.
Jay, from a trial perspective, between the two of us, we probably have, I don't know, close to 40 years on the bench. What do you think the most witnesses you've ever had in a case have been? And you know why I'm asking.
I know why you're asking, because I know what the number of witnesses they had in the trial. I would say probably the most that I've had in a trial might be 10 or 12. Yeah, not many at all.
Yeah, I don't think I've had more than 20. And as you know, I sat criminal for a long time. I was a presiding criminal court judge. Rarely do you have, numbers in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And in this case, Jay, as you recall, you remember the numbers specifically? I jotted them down here.
167 total witnesses.
For one trial.
Yes, 30 days of trial testimony. They also had 67 witnesses on the grand jury in November of 1922. And that was done in 5 days, believe it or not. They were just bringing them in and going right through them. But yeah, there was a lot of witnesses.
And nowadays, they will normally put one or two witnesses before the grand jury, and those witnesses will just summarize other people's testimony.
Sure. Yeah.
Very different process.
and there was somebody, I think a witness, Ralph Gorison or something, I think it was his name.
Yes.
He basically, in my mind, gave pretty compelling testimony.
Well, Ralph Garson was, let's call him a bon vivant, man about town. He was married, but he also had an interest in Eleanor Mills. He kind of viewed the pastor as a rival for these available young women, and Ralph gave testimony in the grand jury testimony in 1922 that then changed when he took the witness stand in the trial in 1926. He said that he had been taking a girl home from the movie theater when they actually went out to the Lovers Lane area. Perhaps they were also looking for mushrooms. Who knows? And he then brought her back home to her home in New Brunswick. So Ralph was somebody who had an interest in one-upping Edward Hall.
But he doesn't he say that he saw Henry, the widow's brother, at the spot, you know, in the woods that night?
He does, yes, yeah.
Right. Which, I mean,
and he hears gunshots.
and he hears gunshots, right? So it places them in the area. I mean, we all agree that Frances, who's the widow, she couldn't have done it alone.
Right.
Right. That she had to have help. I mean, the just the graphic way Eleanor was killed and taking on two people, and I don't think anybody would argue Frances could have done it by herself.
No,
I guess
no.
the question is who accompanied her? Is
Yeah.
it the you know, is it the singer's husband? You know, do the two spouses go there confrontationally? Do her brothers go with her? Which the brothers who were actually charged.
Right.
And you know, her brothers are the characters as well. I mean, and I think the younger brother Willie had was on the autism, I guess, spectrum. Right, he was a bit of a character about town, like to
Yes.
hang out with the firemen.
Yeah.
Right, and
That was Willie. Willie did live with Frances Hall.
Willie was upset because apparently the pastor controlled his, for lack of a better way, putting his trust funds.
That's right.
He's giving something in the neighborhood of $25 a day, a week, to live on.
Mhm.
And while that was probably more than sufficient, he wasn't paying for room and board. When you are part and parcel of a family whose wealth, and I looked it up, is almost $400 million in today's dollars, at $2 million when you translate it from 1922 to today, it increases substantially. You know, $25 a week is not a lot. So he had some, I would suggest, I use the word seething underlying anger directed at his inability to access more money at any given time.
Yeah, and so Willie lived with them, and the press, which ultimately there was over 300 reporters from around the country that were handling that were there for the trial, but the press called him kind of simple-minded Willie. Was I guess that would be the kindest thing that they said about Willie Stevens. So.
And so, but Henry gets placed at the scene at the time, you know, from somebody who, you know, whether he had a motive to lie or not. I mean, Eleanor's dead. I mean, Ralph's not going to get a chance with Eleanor anymore by telling his story that he saw Henry there.
Yeah, but
and it's more likely he got paid off to change his testimony.
Part of the problem with the Stevens connection with Johnson & Johnson and the money, there were those that believed that some of that money was being spread around to potential witnesses for the grand jury in 22, and that's one of the reasons that the grand jury did not come down with any indictments against anybody. But Henry Stevens, the older brother, lived in La Valette. And during the course of the trial, there were several witnesses that took the stand from the La Valette area, and I kind of think that Henry wasn't there, that he was home, but Willie was there. So,
you know, Jay, what do you think of the fact that in 1922, when the matter is presented to the grand jury, and they take all the testimony, they come back basically doing nothing? It was coming out of Middlesex County. And the Johnson & Johnson family and fund and the folks, you know, who lived in New Brunswick, Middlesex County. John Tulin was appointed the prosecutor in Middlesex County. John Tulin eventually became Senator Tulin. Do you think politics might have had something to do with Middlesex County's lack of action?
Yes, indeed. Certainly Democratic county back then, as now, and Somerset County was pretty predominantly controlled by the Republican Party.
Which it is now.
which it is now. And yeah, plus the expense. This was going to be obviously a lot of money spent for it, and Middlesex County would be more than happy to have Somerset, bear that cost. And there was initially this fight between the two prosecutors, the two counties, as to who should take over. But ultimately, it was tried in Somerset County.
Well, it was tried in Somerset County because of the Somerset County indictment in 26, right?
Well, it was the bodies were found in Somerset County, and so that's
Right.
how ultimately.
I thought who was it that no billed the first or did not take action? Was that a Middlesex County or Somerset County jury?
Somerset County.
Okay, so they're both Somerset County juries.
Right. Right.
All right.
And the governor in 22, A. Harry Moore, initially appointed a special prosecutor from Essex County, and in 1926, when we get involved with the rag newspapers, Philip Payne, who was the editor of the New York Daily Mirror, which was one of the Hearst newspapers. The mayor the governor at that time was Edwards, and he appointed a special prosecutor, and Alexander Simpson, who was a sitting senator in Hudson County. So you have more politics involved. Hudson County Democrat against Somerset County Republicans, and that was also part of what was going on.
Today's world, we are very careful with the juries that we pick. You want to care to tell us about, if you remember, what the juries were composed of back then? That this jury is composed of
all male, all white,
married, and all married.
Yes. Yep.
And it took, as I understand, a little over an hour to select a jury.
You're right. It did.
And now we would take days to pick a jury?
Days to pick a jury to that.
And it would be a cross section of the community at a minimum, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And socioeconomic background as well, right? You do your best to have some level of variety to the extent that you could, pulling from a pool of potential people in a certain area, but you don't really have that. You have people who are very impressed with, you have to remember Frances and her brothers, right? They employ half the town. And those who they don't employ, they're easily able to bribe, and people are attracted to money in a way that I believe still goes on today, right? We tend to look at celebrities and rich people in general on somewhat of a pedestal, just believing that they would never do bad things, because why do they need to, right? They have great fame or great amounts of money.
Sure.
And right. And then I think that that really hasn't changed in society. Like that was the same, if you put it in context, thing that was going on then. Just like it was hard to get a conviction on O.J. Simpson, because at the end of the day, people saw him, running through the airport or down the field. It was kind of the same then. They're put on a pedestal. They live in a mansion. People want to believe that people, like in that setting, don't do bad things.
You're right. Absolutely right. Yes.
And so you do have an element of that. I mean, they get acquitted ultimately. This grand jury, the first time they don't come up with enough, to really charge them. They say, all right, so they think they're free and clear. Frances and her brother, I think, Willie, they go traveling. A few years goes by.
Right.
Right. And then there comes a point in time where the scandal starts to ooze its way back up. Because of a particular, tabloid newspaper that always kept it in the headlines, always kept, because it was such a nation grabber, had kind of a headline. It wasn't just unique. We're talking about it from New Jersey's lens, and I guess we're all really familiar with it because of its origin here. But in reality, this is something that grabbed the headlines across the country. it's big news, right? Oh
Yeah.
my goodness, a religious guy, and is the younger singer. Everybody's married. There's money. There's
Perfect.
gory deaths. This is a
Perfect.
nationwide headline grabber.
Sure.
It is the perfect tabloid piece.
Yep.
Think about it.
And
And
And that's why he kicks it up, right? That's
well, I
why
think I
the
think what happened,
horrified.
it kind of died right after the presentation in 1922. And then in 1926, the maid who stayed with him and was the maid back in 22 had gotten married. And the maid's husband, I think it was Geist,
Arthur Real.
Arthur Real, filed a request for an annulment, not a divorce, but an annulment. And the basis, as I recall, for the annulment was his position. And I'm not sure that it's the basis for annulment as I understand family law, although it might be back then, it isn't now.
Right.
But that his wife had participated in the murder cover up and had taken money and been bribed, and he was unaware of it at the time of the marriage.
Mhm.
Now, I don't know whether or not the court said, well, that's sufficient grounds for an annulment, or why an annulment rather than the divorce would be better. But that just kicked it right into high gear, because now we had somebody coming in saying, oh, we have another witness who's actually there, who actually participated, who actually took money. And the newspapers got a hold of that, and it just, as you say, Toni Ann, kicked off, and it became not just national but international tabloid news.
That's where Phil Payne came in. He had been made the editor of that newspaper shortly before that, and the annulment complaint was filed in Union County, and it was filed in July, and the Arthur Real said, "Oh yeah, she told me that she was paid. She was there. She was there with the widow and Willie, and she was paid $5,000 to keep quiet." And so that was the basis supposedly for the annulment. Well, Phil Payne comes across that and is off to the races.
And this pressure, I think, political. I think the governor put pressure as well when these headlines were coming out that somebody had to look into this again.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
The uh, Eleanor Mills' daughter, who by that time was around 20 years old. Interestingly, she was called in the press the flapper daughter, and she was writing letters to everybody, including the governor, demanding justice for her mother, to find the mother's killer.
Well, that's an
And
important thing that gets swept under the carpet, doesn't it? A little bit. When we remember the story, we remember the scandal. But she left behind two kids, right? A
Yep,
daughter and a son. And her daughter never stops fighting for justice for her. They had to have been close.
they were, yes.
This is not something where the daughter's just like, oh, this terrible thing happened. But I mean, the daughter keeps fighting. Like, you got to figure out who did this. The daughter doesn't stop. Daughter's pretty like the mother,
Mhm.
and I would imagine carried a great burden in being one of the few people who was interested in getting to the bottom of it.
Sure.
Right. Whereas most people liked the scandal aspect of it. I think there were a lot of people, especially morally at the time, who kind of wrote that off, that crime off. I don't know how interested society in general was in solving it. Um, what do you think, judges? I'll put that out there. I mean,
I'll ask you what society thinks about the fact that a cheating husband and the cheating spouse end up being murdered. I think right off the bat, you've got two cheaters. Right off the bat, you have a very moralistic society and marriage. I think you might have inferred it meant something more, but I'm not saying it did or did not, but there may have been a different perception, or a more stronger perception. And, it's fodder for the tabloids, but I can see a whole lot of people saying they deserved it. They
Yes.
asked for it. Went on for, Jay, 4 years, give or
4
take.
years. Yep. Yeah.
They were leaving love letters in the hymnals,
That's right.
to each other. And just to put things in perspective, just as that $2 million is, almost, 400, the $5,000 that was paid is approximately almost $90,000 in today's money.
Sure. Yeah.
So you're talking about somebody who could really spread around some serious cash.
Yeah.
And
And
That's
didn't one
come
of
back.
the police officers or something die with a $90,000 estate or the like with a decent amount of money beyond what he would have earned as a police officer?
Yes, indeed. Yes, there was one of the officers in New Brunswick that was first dispatched out there. When he died, his family was pretty surprised at the extent of the estate that he left over. And yeah, it was around $90,000. I think he passed away sometime in the 1940s. So that would have been a lot of money, certainly back then,
I, I
more
can
than
I
more
can
than he would have earned as a salary.
I can put it into the calculator and figure it out if you like. You know, one of the things that I think you really need to look at, and we think of the forensic we have available to us today, a crime scene like that would have been cordoned off within 25 seconds. There would have been just a complete inability for the public to walk on the crime scene, to take things from the crime scene. But the reality was, back then, that crime scene, because of the jurisdictional issues and because of just the way it was handled, was trampled by the citizens of both counties. Just
That's
through
right.
curiosity seekers, people taking pieces of the bark from the cherry tree. There was apparently, Jay, a business card of the pastor who
Yes.
was left there, like a calling card.
Yeah.
And it eventually, they found out that it had the fingerprint of Willie on it.
Mhm.
And because it was left outside for 36 hours, the time before the bodies were found, and because it was passed around the way it was, jury apparently just discounted it entirely. It was an awful, awful crime scene in terms of the security of it and the keeping it sacrosanct and pristine. Of course, they didn't have the kind of forensics we have now, but there was no footprints, that they could match. There was nothing because of the number of people just taking things from the scene.
Sure. Yeah. Overrunning the scene at all. As I said, it became almost like a circus-like environment there.
Judge Jorgensen, can you summarize the actual trial? I mean, once it starts, they actually get indicted, right? And the sister and the two brothers go on trial. So the widow of Reverend and her two brothers go on trial. I think there's a cousin that's kind of waiting in the wings, but he doesn't go on trial with them. But those are the three people who go on trial as the defendants. Can you kind
Right.
of summarize what the trial looks like?
Yeah.
Pig lady and all.
That's the real beauty of it. The big lady. Well, the trial's held in the Somerset County Courthouse, which had been built in 1910, and so it was a relatively new courthouse. As I mentioned, there's about 300 reporters from around the country that are coming to Somerville to report on this trial. The trial will take 30 days in November into December of 1926, and the, the news reporters are able to get their stories out pretty quickly because there is a huge telegraph machine that had been used in Philadelphia 2 weeks earlier in the Tony Dempsey boxing match. And so they moved that in whole, they put it in the basement of the courthouse in Somerville. And so they were able to get their information out as quickly as possible. So there were 167 witnesses that testified during the trial. The self-proclaimed Babe Ruth of witnesses was Jane Gibson. Jane Gibson lived about a mile from the where the bodies were found, and it was her testimony that on the evening of the murders on September 14th in 1922, she lived out there by herself. She had some pigs. She had about 4 dozen pigs, and so the newspapers called her the Pig Lady. Well, she was concerned that people were stealing her corn. She thought that some people were stealing her corn, so she heard them. So she got on her mule Jenny and followed supposedly, and that's how she got to close to where the murders took place. She testified that she saw the widow there, and that she also saw Willie there. She heard the shots. She went back to her home, and then she went back to to the scene of the crime again because she had lost one of her moccasins, and so she went back there about 2 hours later, and again she saw Willie and his sister there. So when it comes time for the testimony from 1922 until 1926, every time she tells her story, it gets more and more detailed and more fantastic. And she's telling people that when she takes the witness stand, she's the Babe Ruth of this case. Babe Ruth being obviously a very famous baseball player at the time. So when the trial started, Alexander Simpson, who's the prosecutor, the special prosecutor from Hudson County, he's a sitting senator, and he wants to call Jane Gibson early in the trial. But Jane, unfortunately, has some medical problem, and so she's taken to the hospital in Somerset County. And so ultimately, when Simpson is going to call her, the doctors come in. They say, "No, you can't. She's deathly ill. She can't testify." That set Senator Simpson off. He demanded that the court take the jury and the judges go to the hospital, take her testimony there. Judges said, "No, we're not going to do that," but they didn't go after the day's testimony, and they went to the hospital and did talk to her, but not to take her testimony. Simpson didn't think that the Somerset County Hospital was doing a good job, so he had it moved to Hudson County. And ultimately, later in the trial, she's going to come down from the hospital in Jersey City in an ambulance, and will be wheeled into to the courtroom on a hospital gurney, and she testifies lying flat on her back in the well in the courtroom. The courtroom is packed, and when her name is called, a woman jumps up and starts screaming, "Liar, liar, liar!" Well, it turns out it's her mother, who doesn't think much of her daughter. Her testimony is just fantastic. Nobody, I'm sure, believed her testimony. And so ultimately, after the 167 witnesses have testified, there's 2 or 3 days of summations by the attorneys. The judge finally gives the closing instructions to the jury, and they take a couple hours, and they come back that not guilty for both the widow and her 2 brothers. And the press immediately runs out to start sending the story out. And that's kind of the overview, quick overview of the trial. The defendants, Mrs. Hall, she's represented by Robert McCarter, who had been the Attorney General from New Jersey, and also Clifford Case represented one of the defendants. Clifford Case would become the Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court in its last iteration from 1947 to 48. Clifford Case himself was a sitting senator from Somerset County. So again, you have all this political angst going back and forth between Simpson, who was all of 5 feet tall, and Case from the Senate there. They were referring, the press was referring to the 7 attorneys that were representing the 3 defendants as the $1 million representation. It was probably close to that. So.
The 1920s dream team, right?
Absolutely, the dream team. Yes, yeah.
Now later on, and most people don't know this, in the 1970s, right? There's a witness who's he thinks he's on his deathbed, and he overhears the nurse saying something that, that he could possibly die. So he says he wants to get something off his chest beforehand. Julius, right?
Yes, yes.
Can you speak to Julius's story?
Yes, Julius was probably a young teenager in 1922, and he's friends with Willie Stevens. And Julius tested. He gets. He wants to get this off his chest. He tells New Brunswick police, and New Brunswick police bring in the state troopers. And ultimately, he takes a lie detector test as well and passes the lie detector test as best, I guess, as you can. But his testimony is that Willie Stevens comes to him after the murders have occurred and asks him for a favor. He wants him to give some money to some people, and so Julius says okay and goes along with Willie. They come to there's a car that's parked, and the widow is in the car. Apparently, one of her attorneys was in the car as well. And they get out and they give Julius two envelopes, $5,000 in each envelope, and he's to give to two individuals who Willie indicates were the people that committed the murders, and one of those people that received the money shortly thereafter was killed. The other guy died of cancer in the early 1930s, and neither of those made any confession. So, the justification for Julius's testimony is that he's paying the widow's paying off two people that actually committed the murders.
And are known criminals in the area.
Absolutely, yes, they are. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that I think that little snippet, of information doesn't really get the attention it warrants, right? I mean, because here he is, he's later in life, he thinks, all these years has gone by, almost no one is left, right?
That's right.
He's one of the last survivors of that, of the era, and certainly that were in the mix of that story.
Right.
And he's coming forward with this piece of information, that he says, look, before I die, I got to get this off my chest. So he's obviously lived with it all those years. There's no reason for him to come forward at that point, but he does. So I mean, it stands to reason that she did pay off these local criminals. And what would be the basis for that, if it wasn't truly, her connection to the murders?
That's right, the murders, yes, yeah.
Right. So while it sounds like they may have met the murderers at the scene, like everyone gathered. I suspect there was a crowd as opposed to, one person and a pistol.
Yeah. Of course, my theory of the case is that the two criminals weren't involved. That Frances Hall was aware of what's going on. She had received Mr. Hall received a phone call earlier that evening from Eleanor Mills, and Mrs. Hall probably overheard the phone call. So when he leaves the house at 7:30 at night, they ultimately meet up. He and Eleanor meet up out at Lover's Lane. She's pretty confident, pretty sure that knows where it's going. So she goes out with her brother Willie to confront. So she got the letters to confront the two of them, and I think it just it got away with them, so to speak. And Mr. Hall or the Reverend tries to deny it and tries to leave, and Willie, being Willie, I think he pulls the trigger, and then Eleanor Mills just goes crazy, and so that's when Willie just goes crazy and shoots her 3 times as well. So then they come back and they scatter some of the letters, and they come back and they cut the throat. That's where so that's my theory of the case.
You think they went back a second time, Jay, to do the throat and larynx?
Yeah, I think that they did go back the second time, because there is some testimony during the trial about coming and going at the mansion a couple of times that night. The last time being 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, there was a night watchman or something that would not necessarily for that place, but walk the streets of New Brunswick, I guess, and
correct, and saw them entering the home and leaving the home. So that's why I do think that I don't think that they were the first time. I don't think it's to kill them. It's to confront them, and so they got to do the good job and screw those.
You think they went back and got the letters and then went back, or you think they had the letters with them?
I think they had the letters with them because it's hey, what's going on between you two, that type of thing. But you probably need a very sharp knife to do what you want to do to Eleanor. Yeah.
I'm gonna agree with you, except I'm gonna say the shot went out out of anger, and then they killed her because they got it on both. Went back and got the letters,
Okay.
and then posed the bodies at that point.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. And the
because
call and the calling card, the Reverend's business card, calling card, propped up on the foot. That's really to make sure that everybody knows who that is. There's nothing and in fact the newspapers, the afternoon newspaper on Saturday afternoon of September 16th of 1922 said Reverend Hall and a woman found dead. So.
Well, I would argue that the idea is then to help to make sure he dies in shame, right?
Mhm.
To point out that he was the Reverend,
And they both were.
right? And I mean, I think that would be the obvious purpose of connecting the name to making sure here's his card, so nobody mistakes who he is and where he works.
Right.
Yeah, that's why I think what happened. The initial shooting was with 38, which really apparently had a 38, though they said the firing pin was filed down, so it couldn't be used. But one, I don't think that's true. Went off almost accidentally, killed him, and then they killed her. Went back, and then I think Toni Ann, they said, you know what? Let's go put this man exactly where he deserves. Let's put those letters there. Let's put the calling card there. Let's, rip out this. I'm not going to use words because I'm sure they were not polite. Her throat and larynx, her tongue and larynx, and
Yeah.
those are acts of anger,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Brutality, absolute
brutality, and anger.
brutality.
And I'm really, and again, you're really guessing. We're trying to infer from the evidence as best you can, but I think there was the anger built up after the murder at night because neither of these folks really had any history of murders or assaults.
Yeah.
But as they drove back, I think as they talked about it, they became angry and convinced themselves that he deserved it. He was an adulterer, he was an SOB, he was this, he was that. And I think they justified their own conduct, as people often do, and went back and dumped the additional evidence to prove who he was and why he was killed. I don't think they thought, as often happens, that it would almost by necessity infer that they must have had something to do with it. But I think they missed that leap. And it's not surprising with Willie, who was not the brightest person in the world, but you might have thought better of the wife. But again, I think her anger was just probably palpable. She'd been putting up with this for years. It was an open secret.
It was, yeah. And she and Eleanor Mills were friends. She taught
They
her.
went to get back on together.
Yeah, yeah,
Sat in the same car.
right.
Oh, they got back to New Brunswick. She dropped her off at the house.
Mhm. Yeah.
So this is interesting to me, though. So Judge Jorgensen, you think that you don't think there was a payoff with the Julius indicated to the criminals, or you think the criminals were involved in some other way, or that none of that is true?
I don't think that there was a payoff. I don't know why Julius would say that, but I don't.
You don't believe him.
I don't believe him. I don't believe him. Yeah. Although it's tough not to believe somebody who thinks that they're dying and will tell the story. But it just seems to me that that type of information would have popped up somehow in 22, 23, 24, because you've got two alleged criminals that are being paid off. Somebody's going to be mentioning, because they're going to be flashing some serious dollars around New Brunswick, and where they get that money from. So I don't know. That's
Maybe it's two folks from the fire department where Willie like to hang out. And his two friends got involved. Now what do? Do they turn these folks in? Do they turn their friend in? Or do they just keep their mouth shut and later on say, you know what? We'd like to continue to keep my mouth shut. Can you help us out?
yeah.
Yeah.
Really,
It's interesting to me. I mean, I do see it as somewhat of a deathbed confession. because he believes he's dying when he says it and he passes the lie detector test. So, I mean, I think I differ with you on this, and I think they were involved in some way.
Mhm.
You also have to wonder, like, did Willie and Francis have the capabilities of doing what they did with her? Right? She's brutally killed. You know, it's not just the shots. Okay, somebody shot her extra times, but the way they, you know, they literally carve out like her tongue and her larynx. I mean, it's just it's brutal. It's gory.
Right.
Do they have it in their wheelhouse to have done that? Did they need somebody else to do that? Did somebody else involved in some other way? I mean, there was some chatter at the time that maybe they were kidnapped, the Hall and Mills, from a different location and brought to that location so it would be more desolate. I mean, could these criminals have been involved in any way?
Well, you use the word criminals. I'm going to infer that the folks who work in the fire department have seen injuries, have pulled people out of burning buildings, are not put off by blood, guts, and gore because of what they do at the firehouse and the first aid that they often render to people who are injured as a result of fires and other catastrophes. And they went there as a friend to help, and it got carried away. And at that point, what do? You turn them in, you turn Willie in, you turn Francis, and what do you do? Or you just keep your mouth shut and get paid off.
Yeah. Well, but okay, that's the beauty of unsolved mysteries. But if it's the guys from the fire department, you know, Julius pegs them as criminals. That one guy gets murdered, and you know, so it's
Right. But you don't tell them when they're from the fire department, you know.
Right.
And by the way, I've never heard the theory before. I just going by the seat of my pants based upon what I'm hearing, you know.
Well, he says that these two are known criminals.
Right.
Right? They're referred to in anything I've ever read as quote unquote thugs, whatever that means.
Yes.
But I mean, they're known criminals. So I mean, to finger known criminals, to me, it's explainable that Julius didn't come forward before then because, you know, nobody wants to rat out known criminals and then, you know, put your own head on the chopping block. And, you know, maybe he was somewhat one of them, you know, in the area. I don't know. But you know, to me, it's believable that he wouldn't have come forward then.
Mm.
So in the back of my mind, Judge, I feel like that there was some involvement with these people that they paid, but to what extent, I don't know.
Right. Okay. But both of them also were no longer on the scene by the early 1930s.
Right.
So there's roughly, I think Julius gave this confession. I think it was late 1960, 68, something like that. So there's, you know, 30 years go by and he's keeping it under wraps.
Yeah,
So,
that's true too. Why keep it a secret?
yeah.
More
I think,
questions than answers.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
I think we need Mr. Peabody in his Wayback Machine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, you've done an enormous amount of research. I assume you've gone to the New Brunswick Public Library. They keep all the boxes on the case.
Actually, the New Jersey State Archives has the trial testimony from the 1926 trial, and I've gone through that. It's 5,000 pages, 14 boxes. The New Brunswick Library has also a lot of the stuff. They also have the transcripts from the 1922 grand jury, and I've gone through that. So that's pretty interesting stuff. Now recently they received the president of the library, who's also president of the New Brunswick Historical Society, had received information from an estate in New York for an attorney that they had 8 boxes of stuff. The attorney was Tom Pfeiffer, who was prominent New York trial attorney, and he represented one of the defendants in the Hall Mills murder trial. And so he had 8 boxes of stuff related to the trial. And so the president of New Brunswick Historical Society and his wife, they drove up to New York and procured those 8 boxes, and they're in the process of going through them and you know, putting stuff on CD. And he promised that I'd get a copy of that CD. So I'm looking forward to the letter from Tom Pfeiffer saying, it was me or somebody, something like that. So.
Well, I will tell you, Jay, having done defense work for many years, I would never have put down my defendant admitted the offense, but who knows the personal notes read.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. But
Well, also, I mean, I think the boxes probably have even more historical account, of what happened, whether it be as notes at the time, probably letters, newspaper clippings, maybe, because a lot have been lost in time. We only really have the newspaper clippings of them, whatever was kept on microfilm,
Right.
that is
I'll tell you what you might find that of his interest. When you're doing defense work, you have, especially this kind of defense work, you're going to have an unlimited budget. And with an unlimited budget, you have investigators on staff who go out and do interviews. Those interviews result in reports that are given to you. You don't turn them over to the state unless you intend to call that witness, but you would keep them in the file. So there may be interviews in there of folks that we don't know about, or interviews in there of folks that we know about, but we've never seen. And there may be things in there that are incriminatory in one way or another, or exculpatory in one way or another. And you won't know until you see the defense file, because in criminal trials, the obligation of the defense to turn over discovery, is limited. You don't have an obligation to turn over inculpatory evidence unless you intend to call the witnesses that are involved in inculpatory evidence. So
there's also the physical evidences around too.
That's also true. Sure.
At the courthouse in Somerville, Somerset County Courthouse, there's a display of the Reverend's hat, which was over his head. There's the scarf that she wore. There are shoes and some pictures that are there, and then also the Alexander Library at Rutgers has the clothing that's just in their archives boxes. So it's the stuff is still around. So.
Yeah, I mean, the fascination. I mean, getting those new boxes of pieces of history is somewhat amazing for anything new to come out right from the 1920s. So
Sure.
that's, I think, going to be a treasure trove. I mean, I hope you come back and talk to me about that when once you get that. But you wrote, you and your wife, I believe, wrote a play based upon the story, correct?
Yes, we did. It's called the Home Mills Murder Trial. The trial of the century, and what we did was that was why I had to go through the trial testimony, because all the words of the in the play were the actual words that were testified to or said by the lawyers or the judges or the witnesses, and there was a prominent reporter back then, Damon Runyon, and Damon Runyon attended every day of the trial and wrote a newspaper article each day about the trial, and so I was able to get those from that he had published as well. So the testimony is the actual testimony from the trial. We put that together. Now, initially, when we the first draft of it, we sat down on a Sunday afternoon in January when it was snowing outside, just to see how long it would take. It took 3.5 hours to read through the testimony. So we had cut, and ultimately the trial, the play itself runs for about an hour and 40 or an hour and 45 minutes. Part of that is because the person that plays the prosecutor, the defense attorney, is Judge Ferencz, playing the part of Robert McCarter. So we put it on. The first time we put it on was actually in the courtroom where the trial was conducted, which was
in Somerset, right? That's pretty cool.
Pretty fantastic. Yeah. Yes, it was very cool. After that, we then did it for the New Jersey Institute for Continuing Legal Education for CLE credits. We put it on before the judges, Judicial College, and then we had 4 nights that we ran in the Avenel Arts Center, and we were fortunate we sold out each night, so it was a lot of fun. It's going to be resurrected again. We have 2 nights in January, June 22nd and 23rd. It's going to be in the theater over in Old Bridge. I think the theater is where it's located.
And I want you to know, just a point of interest, that I have now won about 8 consecutive trials.
That's true. So,
Well, I mean, I'm certainly going to put a link up for anyone who wants to go or buy tickets. If you're in New Jersey, it's definitely worth worth the trip to see. Um, this is a fascinating story. Do you fictionalize any of it, Judge, or you just stuck to the transcripts?
no, just the transcripts themselves, just the words that were spoken. So I didn't want to do anything other than that. Damon Runyon, his information though is used to kind of
Narrate.
narrate. Yeah, he's the narrator for the play, and it's his words, and I play him as the narrator. All the people that are in the play, we are not thespians. We are judges and family attorneys that participate in family law, and we're all part of what's something called the Aldana Appleton Family Law in a Court. So that's how we get along to do that. So.
Well, I mean, you know what? It's a story that never ends. And I'd argue if somebody had gone to jail for it, nobody would remember it.
Right.
Right? But
Yep.
nobody ever went to jail for it. And so it remains unsolved in the truest sense of it. Although I don't know, quite frankly, that a criminal conviction is always the litmus test for whether a case is solved or not, right? Sometimes juries get it right, sometimes they don't. But in the mind of the world, this is an unsolved double homicide. And there was just such sensationalism surrounding it that it just stays with us, right? It's
It does.
it's like people will always romanticize, Elvis Presley or Marilyn Monroe, to the extent that, they died younger, they were so beloved. I would say, I would argue at the height of their careers somewhat. I know Elvis was really older at that point, but still so in demand and so popular.
Mhm.
That I think that got somewhat romanticized, and so they remain these epic, celebrity figures, iconic in a way that I don't know if they had lived and gone into being 80 and 90-year-old people, would it be quite the same?
That's right.
And I think that for me, this case feels a little bit like that because it's unsolved. It just always remains this fodder for gossip. I mean, just the three of us, right? We're three relatively educated individuals, right? Who've been out on the law, many years. And we're still like, what do you think? Like, it could have been this, it could have been that. Like, and we're still wondering. So I do think it brings with it such enormous interest, this story.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, right now, I'm working on a project, that fictionalizes, though, Judge, some of it, to get a little bit juicier into the details.
Sure.
But I do think I love that you bring attention to this story the way that you do. And I think it's great. I think if anybody can get out there and see the show, you should. I guess it has a little bit of a documentary feel to it, in that regard.
Right.
You're bringing the truth to the masses as to actual events and how they happen and what people said, and telling this story. So I applaud you. It's a great story to perpetuate, because I think it holds a lot of truths. Right. I think people don't change all that much, right? Jealousy leads to bad things.
And it's true. Yes.
Right. And sometimes, cheating leads to bad things, right? And I think the money, often buys people out of trouble. I mean, I think those are somewhat universal truths that were true then and are true now.
You're absolutely correct. I think. Yeah.
And I think that it does stand for that. And I think it deserves its due because it's the first of its kind,
Mhm.
right? I mean, anyone could argue against me that if the Lindbergh kidnapping comes up next, or that some other thing would have triggered tabloid journalism anyway, some other event, some other sensationalized story. But the truth is, this is the one that does.
This is the one that started it. Yep.
Yep.
Right? We can all point fingers and say, oh, something else big was going to come along and kick it off anyway. But this is the case that kicks it off because of that. People are as horrified, right? It's the old, you're driving by the accident scene, and as much as it's graphic and horrible, and I can't look, everyone's peeking through, right? Their finger to see exactly, it's
I don't think
somewhat
it's
like that.
horrified. I don't think it's horrified. I think that people find it fascinating. They find it intriguing. They find it interesting.
But,
Um,
but they have to look.
and they have to look. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what choice do you have, right? I mean, there's still this horror to the whole thing. I mean, for me, finding out how she was killed, because it's not just representative of okay, they were judge and jury, right? They went there, they determined you've done this, therefore it warrants your death, and they execute them, right? That's the end, that's the reality of what happened.
Right.
But then they do this truly gory, revengeful thing, which again, to me, just feels dripping in jealousy and hate,
And
um,
disdain.
Yes.
disdain, for
Yeah.
sure.
And
Uh,
then they pose everybody, and they have the bodies touching each other, and they have them, fully dressed and fully, if you will, set down as if they were napping.
They create the scene. Look at these people, everyone. They lived in and died in shame.
Right.
And that's the message, right? That's here's his card. We don't know no one to mistake who he is and where he works. And then they put the love letters there as if people are going to go, oh, well, you see, they
This
were
is what
having this
happened.
affair, so that they got what they deserved. Like
What
nobody's
happened?
going to investigate it once they find the love letters.
Yeah.
Um,
As a little side note, during the autopsies, they or during the funerals, I'm not sure which it was, and maybe you would remember, Jim. They cut into her to see if she was pregnant.
Right.
And the one, I guess, the person doing it, and again, I don't remember the funeral director, I think it was, and the other person, to confirm it, he reopened her and looked again, just because they both had a look. And you want to talk about the period and interest. Here you are, and again, Jay, you might remember, I don't know if it's at the autopsy or at the funeral, cutting her open to see if she's pregnant. One person says, no, she's not pregnant, but the other person literally has to, turn your neck, stop your car, take a look, open and look for themselves.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And interestingly enough, when it came time for the for each of these special prosecutors, the evidence was lost. The autopsies, they didn't find the autopsies for a while. It just
Did they ever find them, Jay?
they did, but it's just slipshod. It's just if they found them for the 1926 grand jury. They weren't around for the 1922 grand jury, for whatever reason. So.
well, I'm going to close out the podcast here. I think it's a great place to stick a pin in it. Judge Jorgensen, I'm going to say, please come back when you get to go through the new boxes and chat with us.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes.
I'm curious to see what this new treasure trove of evidence, unveils. I wonder if we're all going to be surprised.
Maybe they'll have an investigation in which somebody confesses and, the defendants actually say, yes, this is how we did it. And he took notes. You never know.
If you're a criminal attorney, though, would you? I don't know.
I would not. I, on a personal note, and I was a criminal attorney for over 20 years. I would not write down my defendant confessed or how he did it. Now I might write something down as to, how I think it might have been done, but I would not put that in writing. But there are lawyers who take notes and see, you're under an ethical obligation if you know somebody's guilty, in a sense, not to put them on the stand to perjure themselves.
But they took the stand.
They all did,
took the stand, and they were asked specific questions. They weren't asked like, okay, tell us what happened, because we get around that obligation if a defendant confesses and says they want to testify and deny it. you say, well, you have a right to take the stand. You have to tell the truth. And they say, well, I'm going to deny it. You still have to put them on, but you really can't do a whole lot of direct examination because then you're facilitating the perjury. So you really say, okay, tell the jury what happened, and you step back and let him do what he chooses to do. But from a defense perspective, I would really avoid and have told many clients, I'm not really interested in whether you did or didn't do the offense. Let's figure out what we can do to stop the prosecutors from proving beyond a reasonable doubt that you did it. Let's assert your rights as a criminal defendant for a fair and just trial.
Right.
Make sure the evidence is legitimate, the rules are enforced, and let's see what the prosecutor can put forth. Let's see how they do.
Yeah, I don't know, Judge. I mean, I think it's possible that they could have told the truth to an attorney, their own attorney, believing, a
Absolutely.
lot of people think the attorney, because the attorney-client privilege would have protected them from the attorney coming forward to say, yeah, they
Correct.
did it.
Correct. But you can't commit, for lack of a better way of putting it, kind of future crimes. And if you were facilitating a perjury,
No, not future crimes. That's correct.
and you kind of put yourself in a very unfortunate ethical, legal kind of bind. So, lawyers can withdraw from cases. I can't pursue this. Why? I can't tell you, Your Honor. Or they can choose a route where they're going to defend the client to the best of their ability. They're going to test the state's evidence. And if the client absolutely demands to take the stand, well, God bless, Godspeed, take the stand, but understand I'm not going to be asking you a whole lot of questions because I'm not going to be part of your story, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Defendant, tell the jury what happened, and you sit down.
There you go.
So Judge Jorgensen, I'm gonna end with you, and just say anything else about the story that you want to tell us before we close out.
Stay tuned. Yeah, interested.
Stay tuned indeed. And how crazy is it that
Yeah.
in 2024,
Yeah.
where you can say stay tuned to this murder that happened in the 20s?
Right, over 100 years ago.
Yeah,
Just
1922.
yeah. So
So, I
again,
mean, I always believe there's still something that potentially that's out there that might hold an answer.
perhaps, yeah,
And maybe that's why this case still there's unrest right around it. Like you still feel like there's something out there that remains
sure.
to come out.
Yeah. And and the locations, we still have the locations. We have the Stevens home, we have the church is still there. The Carmen Street, 49 Carmen Street is where Eleanor Mills and her husband and two kids were had their apartment there. So it's all right there. It's
You think that they're going to clean church one day and find a bucket full of clothes that have blood stains on them, Jack?
yeah. We'll
No,
see.
but I think there could be something out there that maybe tips the scales. I don't know.
Well, there was something that somebody said that they saw a car drive up by one of the other churches, um, and somebody got out and had what looked to be a pistol and went into the back of the church area and dug something up and put something there.
Able to come up with a pistol?
Interesting.
Yeah, but of course,
Yeah, I suppose it's too long to get a DNA sample from any of the clothing.
perhaps, yeah.
Well, the code, didn't she send her like a code out, like to be totally changed or something
Yeah,
to a
but the
cleaners in like
testimony,
Pennsylvania?
Yes.
testimony that there was nothing, it was not stained with any, yeah.
Yeah. Like
Mrs.
right
Hull
afterwards, she wanted a cleaners not in town, but like a totally different state. Yeah.
it was sent to Philadelphia, and
Yeah.
it was dyed black. The coat supposedly.
So that's what I do with the coats that I use in murders.
You do, Judge, you send them out to other states. You have a
Gotta
good,
get, and then dye them
person.
the darkest color possible.
That's right.
So we'll end on that note.
Good.
Thank you both for joining me today. As always, Judge, please come back and tell us more as the story unfolds, as you get to the bottom of the new boxes.
There we go.
Come back and talk to us some more.
Good.
Judge
Thank you, Toni.
Ferencz, Thank you. Thank you for joining me. Judge Ferencz, as always, thank you. You're a fun co-host.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for the invite.